Good day and welcome to the third episode of Cubicle Lift, a Zoomcast podcast, something kind of a cast where we talk about workplace mental health. We no longer have the excuse, this is our first day. I played that joke on the second episode. I'm instantly regretting it. We don't yet have a tagline. I'm thinking workplace mental health is workplace wealth. It may or may not work. We're figuring it out. Anyway, my name is Josh Rivedal. I'm with the Impossible Project. I am a co-host, co-founder of Cubicle Lift. I typically educate and speak around mental health, suicide prevention, books, curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. I'm a survivor of suicide loss, my dad and my granddad. I had been in crisis about 9.5 years ago as well at the time of taping. Are we taping this? 9.5 years ago in 2020. So 2011 was the time when I was having a very difficult time in my life, and luckily I got help. And so I see the value in conversations around this, specifically around my experiences as a loss survivor and as someone who has been in crisis. I don't think you need to hear anything more out of me. I'm going to be playing air traffic controller on this episode, but I want to kick it to my last time it was lovely co-host. This time I'm going to call him illustrious Efrem Epstein, also a dear friend. Please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. Go for it.
Obviously, I'm illustrious, or at least one person in the world thinks that. I got to edit myself here because I got to figure out what I want to say here. If you watch previous episodes, you know that I'm the founder of a 501c3 called Elijah's Journey, which deals with mental health, suicide awareness, and prevention in the Jewish community. I'm also a member of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention's Faith Communities Task Force. My day job, I'm Chief Marketing Officer for a tech company called Zipline in the digital adoption platform space. And a lot of my day-to-day work, which is not directly about mental health, is about editing other people's writing. And I say that there because this goes for the three people that I'm with today. All of them have experience of editing my writing. Several years ago, I was in a book that was edited and compiled by Josh, where I talked about where I shared part of my narrative. I shared a different aspect, same narrative, a different aspect of it in a book, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, of which had three editors. Sally and Frank were two of the editors, and they'll tell you more about it. But I will say I am wearing the shirt from the book. So that's a good way to kick it off to Sally. Talk, Sally. You can vent a little bit about the experience of editing my writing, which I'm sure was an experience that you have a lot to say about. And so honored to have you here.
Very cool. Well, I'm so grateful to be here, and both Josh and Efrem are two of our storytellers in our book, The Guts, Grit, and the Grind, that we'll be talking about in a little bit. Also grateful for our editors, Frank and Sarah, and really this opportunity to be here, tying all this into workplace mental health. I'm Sally Spencer-Thomas. I am a psychologist by training, and I had been in the field of mental health for about 16 years when my younger brother and only sibling died by suicide in 2004. And that has kind of put me on a journey. I found a strong calling at the time. I had actually gotten out of direct mental health services at that time, but I was doing leadership development. And so the idea of systems and cultural change was something that I started to apply to the work to suicide prevention. And I really felt a calling to figure out some bold gap-filling things that would prevent what happened to Carson from happening to other people. And that has led me on a couple of pathways and brings me to this podcast. So one of the first efforts that we developed was a workplace suicide prevention program called Working Minds. And in 2007, when that launched, there were not a lot of engagement. People were like, suicide prevention in the workplace, that just doesn't make sense. But today, I'm very happy to share that with a number of committee members and partners from the American Association of Suicidology, as well as partners from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and United Survivors, which is our nonprofit. we have launched national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention, and maybe on a future podcast we can do a deeper dive around that. But it's been very rewarding, 16 years later, to see this really taking off. And that's pretty much what I do most days, all day, is helping workplaces develop strategies for suicide prevention. The other kind of pathways that this took me on was to partner with the Colorado Public Health and Environment and a full service advertising agency called Cactus to develop a digital tool called Man Therapy, mantherapy.org, that uses humor to engage men to be more proactive in their mental health. And in developing that and garnering all of these storytellers for our video library, we started to feel the power of storytelling and how that really can help men feel like they're not alone, and get hope that there is a pathway through their distressing time. So today, we're very pleased to be on this, and I'm going to take off my virtual background just for a second so I can show you. We have now published not one, there we go, but two volumes of what's going to be a 4-book series called Guts, Grit, and the Grind. And it's an anthology mostly of men's stories of coming through hard time, but it's also some science and strategy, some tools that men can use to help them cope. So that's all I'll say for now. And thanks again so much for having us here.
Thank you, Sally. So appreciate you and your work. And I've known you for a little while, mostly from afar. When I first got into the field in 2011, you interviewed me, I think, for an AAS article. So this was 9 years ago, and that was our first interaction. You were so kind and so generous with your time. So thank you for that. You probably don't remember that, and that's okay. I only remembered it just now.
I remember that our paths have done this for a very long time.
We were both keynotes in Missouri 2 summers ago. Last summer, whenever, like a decade ago, before coronavirus hit. So I appreciate your work and who you are and what you do. Frank King is our next guest. He makes mental health a laughing matter in a good way. Is that a weird thing to say? Probably. He puts the ing in Frank King. I don't know. But no, seriously. Frank, I've just gotten to know Frank's work recently, both the comedy and his work in mental health. And I think they're both pretty stellar. So I want to give Frank a few moments to introduce himself and what he does, what he's about. Frank, please, and thank you.
Well, I am a comedian by trade, born a comic. People always ask me, were you born funny? Yeah, an amusing thing happened on the way down the birth canal, actually. Now, I started comedy day after Christmas in 1985, did comedy clubs for 2,629 nights in a row, 7 years and change, no home, with my lovely girlfriend, then wife, and my wife for 33 years at this point. Did some radio, then got into corporate comedy, and the recession killed that. And that's when I learned what the barrel of my gun tasted like. Spoiler alert, I did not pull the trigger. A friend of mine came up to me after my keynote one day. He'd never heard me say it. I didn't pull the trigger. And he said, hey, man, how come you didn't pull the trigger? Hey, man, could you try to sound a little less disappointed? Depression, suicide run in my family. It's called generational depression and suicide. My grandmother died by suicide. My mother found her. My great aunt died by suicide. My mother and I found her. I was 4 years old. I screamed for days. And I live with major depressive disorder and chronic suicidal ideation. And I met Sally. The first thing Sally and I did together was an auction for her foundation held at the height of the summer in an unair-conditioned airplane hangar.
Which was wicked cool, just really hot.
Yeah, oh man. I was sweating like George Bush at a spelling bee. It was horrible. Anyway, that's where we met. And then I got an email saying, Sally's coming to Portland, an 8-hour class teaching working minds. So that's how we got reconnected. And then I've also taken the QPR gatekeeper training and mental health first aid. And then one day I got a call from Sally and Sarah. They said, look, Frank, we're writing a book on men's mental health. Would you be willing to make it funny and add the automobile metaphors? And I said, wait a minute. You two ladies are writing a book on men's mental health. Don't you think you might need, I don't know, a man? So, but a man. So that's how I got to be a co-editor, and also asked to let me voice the book for Audible. One is done. The Audible version of book 1 is done. I'm working on the Audible version of book number 2. And I was delighted that Sally and Sarah asked me to join. And unusual, I think, for a collaboration like that. We're all still friends after about 4 years. So that's my
true.
Story.
A lot of weekends on Zoom calls with Frank and Sarah, just buckling down and writing, editing. It's actually been a joy.
Yes, it has.
It's been nice working with partners on this book project. I've just started myself with my series, The Impossible Project, but I can tell you there's been, there's months and weeks where it's like, I'm herding cats. What am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? And working with partners is it's become a joy. So I can see how, and the three of you working together it's probably been a lot of fun.
Well, and I will say Sally is the linchpin of the organization. She is the project manager, some would say taskmaster. she's shuttled the train back on the tracks more than once.
Yes, a marathoner at heart. It's a lot of small steps that eventually get you there, and so I will persevere till all four are done, even if it takes us a little longer than we had hoped. But the other benefit for me, and I think for Frank and Sarah as well, is through this process of onboarding all of these storytellers, and believe me, it's been like wonderful. Originally we had envisioned maybe 150-page little booklet, a couple of stories, and when we opened up the call for stories, it just very quickly blew up into a 1,000-page manifesto, and I was like, nobody's going to read a 1,000-page book. So but through the process of this, we now have over 60 storytellers. We've developed this community, and at the height of the COVID crisis, we were on calls on Sunday nights, just connecting for a while, and then just sharing with each other our process of storytelling and so forth. And so that's been also hugely rewarding. We've presented together on panels at conferences and have done some side projects like this. And so having that opportunity to connect all of these men that have been so courageous in their own spaces with each other has also been hugely rewarding.
That's awesome. I thought I was going to initially, my first question was going to be around workplace mental health, but it's not actually. I think this is a really perfect time to start out with why a book on men's mental health? What was the idea, and why even start in that place? Why not other subsections of humanity? Why men? Why mental health? Why not?
Well, I'm gonna credit Sarah right here, Frank, and then I'll turn to you, because Sarah and I both work a lot in the space of workplace men's mental health, male-dominated workplaces, so construction, first responder, and so forth. And we knew in working with these groups over the last several years that there were many stories of suffering, many stories of addiction and trauma and suicide, but they weren't sharing it with each other, but they were sharing with us. We became the trusted partners in those spaces. And we were like, how magical would it be if they all knew each other's stories, and not just us, the trusted, friendly mental health people, right? But other construction workers, other first responders. And so one day Sarah says, I have a crazy idea. And now I know when Sarah says, I have a crazy idea, I need to run like hell, because it's going to take over my life for about a decade, but that's okay. It was a good idea. And well, we had done some video stuff, that's true, through Man Therapy, but we've also felt like the process of writing is also transformational, that we have a lot of data on brain science, Efrem, as well as narrative psychology, that writing your story does something to your brain. It puts a structure on top of it, organizes what feels like chaos into something that's redemptive and comprehensive and cohesive. And so that's kind of how we started leaning to the written stories rather than other forms. And then the other piece is we wanted this to be a tool, not just an inspiration for men, but also something that therapists could use or peer supporters could use with one another, that gave men some action steps that they could take. So I think that's why we ended up in the storytelling format for a book. But I'll let Frank chime in with his thoughts as well.
Well, and Sarah, who is busy, very busy right now with family matters. My favorite line of Sarah's, because she teaches QPR, mostly the first responders, mostly men. She goes, "Hi, I'm Sarah Gaer. I specialize in men," which is a brilliant opening line. And that's indicative of Sarah's sense of humor. And she told me that she, I guess, had conversations with Sally. She'd gone looking at Barnes & Noble brick and mortar store for a book that was specifically on men's mental health that, as Sally said, had resources and action items and activities, and couldn't find it. Went online at Amazon looking for the same thing, couldn't find it. And so got together with Sally and said, look, there's a void in the market. There's a vacuum here, and I think we need to fill it. And then they contacted me to make it funny. And it's wrapped around, it looks like an automobile owner's manual. Because we figured a guy would actually maybe pick up a book that looked like an automobile owner's manual. And turns out there's metaphors that go back and forth, bringing automotive metaphors, tons of them. My personal favorite is, don't you wish the man in your life had a check engine light? And when it goes off, he goes to the mental mechanic, and the mental mechanic puts him up on the rack and then goes, Bob, no wonder you're depressed. You're 2 quarts low on serotonin. So we want to make it funny. We want to make it man friendly. Although I think Sally would agree, I think we're going to sell a lot more copies to women who have a man in their life, a brother, a father, a husband, a son, who has an issue, and they're just at a loss as to how to help.
It's interesting, speaking as one of the authors in this, in that a lot of messaging, which I think is important messaging that's come out, is that men's stories, especially in the workplace, are very overrepresented, and that there needs to be greater diversity. And I would say that in many cases, had I been approached by male editors asking to be a part of this project, I probably would have turned down that invitation for that reason. The reason why I said yes to this, or one of the reasons I said yes, is because I was specifically approached by 2 female editors who were the initiators and were the ones making it go. I said I felt a little bit better about saying yes to this. And just a heads up on that, that's something that we're committed to, the idea of diversity in Cubicle Lift as well. We want to make sure that we never have an episode that's 100% white males. As a matter of fact, we have an episode coming up where we want to have guests that are that represented that. And so I'm probably going to have somebody who's not me sub in for me to co-host that episode, so we have diversity in that episode. It's kind of interesting there in that, on one hand, this is men's stories historically have been overrepresented, but this is probably a case where it's been the other side. And so I think it's really, really important that Sally and Sarah did spearhead that. So it gave a forum to have this in there in a way that I think was also responsible. One other thing I just want to quickly put on there, and hopefully people think it's interesting, what Sally said about the written word spurs other things and spurs other thinking. And something that just occurred to me when she said that I did not put 2 and 2 together on beforehand. So I mentioned that I have a background, that I'm a words person. I'm also something of a numbers person, maybe a interesting hybrid of sorts. And I was just thinking about, I'm very much interested in the calendar. I'm very much interested in patterns in the calendar. And we mentioned in episode 2 that Josh and I first met on the 14th of November, 2011. The number 14 in a month, I don't want to read too much into it, has a number of interesting parallels in my narrative. I think I mentioned that in my narrative that's in the book that Sally, Sarah, and Frank edited, that I officially came out of my depression on July 14th, 2006, on the 14th of the month. I think I might have mentioned in there that I actually was writing about it on the 14th of July several years later. So the number 14 of a month related to my narrative mental health keeps coming on over and over and over again. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe it's the universe trying to tell me something, but I'm going to keep extra care to what goes on in my life on the 14th of months going forward.
I just want to comment on your comment on diversity, because I think it's a really important one, and it plays into our approach on the books. Yes, men's voices are pretty much overrepresented in a lot of spaces. However, in the space of suicide, I would say underrepresented in terms of storytelling, especially in our high-risk groups, because they don't live through their attempts. They don't get to tell their story because they die. So to have that narrative, especially in what we call the double jeopardy men, the men with a lot of risk factors for suicide who also don't reach out for help, that is an underrepresented voice. Our first responders, our construction workers and so forth, because they don't survive or they just have so much shame about their experience that they don't share. That said, we also made a really intentioned effort to make sure that there were voices from communities of color in our book. It was hard. I mean, we're 3 white people, and it was hard to earn their trust in this process, but we continued to persevere. So most of our forewords will be written by men of color, kind of bringing in their perspective of the challenges and opportunities in their very diverse communities. And so we continue to try to enroll all of these diverse voices, gay men. We're looking at involving trans men in our 4th book. So all of that, we're very mindful and very intentional of creating a diverse platform for people.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. That's what I was going to bring that up regarding the diversity of or rather men being this vulnerable seems underrepresented to me. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Sally. I wonder, this is for everybody, but I wonder either how we get men to speak this way, act this way, not necessarily to the level of vulnerability that they share in the book, but to the point where help seeking, help offering conversations like this are happening in the workplace between men and their direct reports or whatever. How do we, and or the book, do we need to slap a book down in the front lobby, the guts and grind? What do we do? I'd love to hear a couple solutions. Looks like Frank is raising his hand.
Yeah, I think when I was putting together my first TEDx talk, I discovered that even though one person dies by suicide in the U.S. roughly every 11 minutes, hardly anybody talks about it unless you bring it up. Just mention the words depression and suicide out loud. Pretty much everybody's got a story. And I think that's the power of speaking on the topic, is that my clients say, we just brought you in here to start the conversation on suicide, because once it started, what I'm doing basically is giving permission to anybody else with a similar story to give voice to their experiences and feelings surrounding mental illness and suicide without recrimination. I did two safety meetings in Iowa for a company that manufactures fire hydrants. And the audience was 95% men. I did 2 shifts, two keynotes, 2 shifts. And I just spoke to the meeting planner in the last month. And she said, Frank, you have no idea the impact you had at those 2 meetings. We had people coming out of the woodwork, man. They have 2 nurses on staff, coming to them and saying, look, I've never told anybody this, but after seeing Frank speak, I need to let you know that I'm struggling with this or struggling with that. So I think it's a matter of starting the conversation. That's my job. I think that's all our jobs. That's the book's job, is to start a conversation and give people permission to give voice without recrimination.
Yep. I would totally agree. And I would just add, for the workplace, there's probably 2 things that I would suggest. And your idea of plopping the book down, it's not a bad idea, right? So have what we call a slow drip over time of constant putting this in front of people. So not just a one-off awareness day or a one-off training, but little things over time, things in the back of the bathroom stalls, reminders in the newsletters, bring it up on meeting agendas, slow drip over time about not just the resources and not just the types of mental health things that people experience, but really, again, people's stories. If people can, share stories out of here or share their own stories. So that's one thing I would say. Build a communication strategy where this is always kind of being brought up in different ways and tied to overall health and safety. The other thing that I would recommend is that workplaces, and we're starting to see this a lot now, actually build out a formal peer support program. There's different pockets of the military that's been doing this. I work with a lot of unions that have started building their formal peer support program. We see this in also in different transportation industries, both air and rail, where they are recruiting people who have natural gifts in compassion and empathy, but they're also, because these are male-dominated industries that are often rewarded for self-reliance or decisiveness, they're often overlooked. So it's an opportunity to recognize and reward these leaders for this incredible gift that they have around compassion and empathy and so forth. And then really building out the structures that we need so that they can be really successful. Some training, some ethics training, some skills building, and then making sure all the referrals that they can do that they know really well. So that's kind of what I see as the new wave of the future, taking some of like the storytellers that we have here and really empowering them to lead peer support within their companies and industries.
And to Sally's credit, by the way, there's a program that she helped put together. I think the tagline is "Take the Pledge." And so, if you're wondering, how do you make this happen in a workplace? Is there a roadmap? And one of the things in her program that I think is very important is it tells the person in management or whatever what the value beyond saving lives is to the company in the way of community goodwill and so forth. Everybody's like, how's that going to affect my bottom line besides simply saving human beings, which is a great goal. But yeah, I think that Take the Pledge, what's the website, Sally? Is it workplace?
Workplacesuicideprevention.com. Yeah, that's where the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention live. And it's way beyond just me. There's dozens and dozens of thought leaders, researchers and employee assistance professionals and HR people and employment lawyers and all kinds of folks that are weighing in to make that a thing. Maybe for a future day, we can talk about that more in depth. But yeah, that's a roadmap, as you said, to get people involved, and just small action steps at first, because it can be overwhelming, but that's where we're headed.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think too, like the other thing that the book does that I think is really helpful is sometimes people have a preconceived idea of what a man who might be struggling with mental health looks like or is like. And this book shatters all of those misperceptions and pretty much says, no, it's pretty much all of us. All of us at one point or another are going to be brought to our knees by overwhelming life events. And just because you see someone that you think has it all together, just know that there's probably a really good chance that they're carrying a very heavy burden that they're just not letting you see. So we have all kinds of different stories in here from all kinds of different men, from all kinds of different socioeconomic backgrounds and careers and pathways through. And so it really helps to shatter that bias that people have.
I want to say something else there, talk about storytellers. One of the other great things about this book is that these are vetted narratives, vetted by people like Sally, Sarah, and Frank. They're really, because there are two sides of this that one needs to wear. One is the stigma and the lack of awareness, and there are definitely companies that say, well, we don't want to talk about this because this is just not something that we want to deal with. It's not proper to talk to the workplace, and there's so much problems with that. And often the people that are pushing back the hardest are the people that are dealing with their own issues. So which I've seen, and so there's that side there. But I will say we're starting to see some of the other side as well too. Sometimes there are companies that are, to their credit, are saying, let's talk about this and let's do programming. But then they do programming that isn't 100% responsible. There are ways to talk about stories, and there are also ways that several of our ally organizations say, you got to be careful. There is certain messaging that is irresponsible. So how do you do programming and how do you storytelling that is both important to do, but at the same time responsible? I think that these narratives really give you a roadmap because they are there, they are out there. At the same time, they have been vetted by people that know what responsible storying should look like, and edited to make sure in cases they need be, and they have the seal of approval that these are examples of responsible storytelling.
You make a very good point, Efrem, in that sometimes very well-intended people can actually make the situation worse. There's a whole scope of guidelines around storytelling, and it's not about pulling people back and censorship and all these other things. It's really to make sure that their story has the intended effect. So these stories are trauma informed. They practice the safe guidelines around messaging that we know if you glamorize or romanticize or talk too much about the means and the death scene and all of that stuff, you run the risk of increasing despair and distress in someone who's already vulnerable. And so That's part of what we're doing, is just kind of coaching our storytellers around that. But then also, we also know the power of what, the National Action Alliance has framed a positive framework. And it doesn't mean that every story has to be wrapped up with a pink sparkly bow of fluffy clouds, because that's not reality. But the positive frame is an action step that somebody can take, highlighting a resource perhaps, or an insight that you got through your journey. We call it the great reward in the hero's journey framework of storytelling. Like, what was one thing that you learned about yourself, about others, about the world as you went through this really hard time? And that's another thing that we, again, coaching our storytellers to think about their story through that framework, because yes, you have to bring to life the despair and distress, or otherwise we can't empathize with what you went through. But if you just leave it at that, the storyteller listener doesn't feel like, okay, why did I listen to that? Now I just feel horrible, So
Right.
trying to figure out what were those pieces, that how you grew through the experience.
Well, and I must say that in writing the book or editing the book with Sally and Sarah, because I came to my first TEDx talk and somebody busted my chops because in the TEDx I said committed suicide. And I said, look, that was my first, I came out that day as depressed and suicidal. I didn't know much about mental health or mental illness, so I used a language that was not safe. So what I've learned over time working with Sally and Sarah, I've learned safe language. And as she says, the proper way to tell a story where you get the point across and they learn something, but it's not triggering, as Sally said, has the intended consequences.
And for those watching, I believe "died by suicide" is the preferred language nowadays. Sally, am I still current on that?
Yes, you are. Yeah. Died by suicide. And then also, if someone has lived through a suicide attempt, it's really about focusing on their resilience. So rather than calling them a suicide attempter or something like that, you talk about, they're fighting suicidal thoughts. They're fighting to stay. They've lived through it, that kind of thing. When you start to talk about it in that language, rather than, oh, it's manipulation, it's a gesture, it's a cry for help. When you use those words, they're fighting, they're living through, you start to feel the strength, right? It just flips how we feel about things. And then that's going to change how we behave also. So yeah,
well,
language is a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, somebody said to me, maybe you need resilience training. And I said, look, here's the deal. Your heart's in the right place. But I got to tell you, my most resilient friends are those who have, who live with mental illness and have had thoughts of suicide. Because if they were not resilient, they would not be here. So it's not a matter of resilience or being strong.
I am so glad that we've taken a conversation this direction. I think storytelling and safe language is really important. It's definitely something that's come up in my life because I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. Been a playwright, an actor. I do this work in this field as more of a speaker or educator, storyteller. And I think I'll tie this up and then I'll segue, transition, all that, because it's time for that on my clock. Just somebody was asking me recently about my efforts in storytelling, and they were like, well, we have people at our school or whatever the organization was, we have people in our, who are willing to tell their story. And I'm like, okay. And so do you have somebody who's coached them on safe language and is a trauma informed, basically, all the steps that you just overlaid, Sally and Frank and F. And it wasn't as much like I need to be the guy to tell my story. It was more so like your intended effect could backfire if there isn't proper context around these stories. So really, really grateful around, this part of the conversation. Segue transition. All right. I thought of something funny.
I'll be the judge.
Exactly. Of course you will. Frank, when you were talking about the fire hydrant conference, I was like, what were all the attendees dogs? Like what? Like that was my mindset because I'm a weirdo. Speaking of what may or may not be funny, I think we've all brought up humor at this point, especially in the context of book. Sally, I can't believe I forgot about Man Therapy. There's a really solid outpost around that here and in Australia, if I'm correct. And I believe that is largely derived from your efforts. And Frank, of course, you're a comedian, so or comedian passing, I should say. I don't know what the right term is. First person language around. Anyway, sorry, didn't land that joke. So, so when talking about mental health or suicide in the workplace or other, while integrating humor, this is for any of us. Does it help? Does it hinder? What's the effect of humor on the conversation?
Well, for me, people ask me, do people not book you to speak on suicide prevention in the workplace because you're a comedian? No, you got it backwards. They book me because I'm a comedian, because, to do 90 minutes on death, dying, morbidity, mortality without, they call it comic relief for a reason. Now, I don't tell jokes, but I share funny stories like my friend coming up and asking why I didn't pull the trigger. That actually happened. So it's a real life story. Meeting planner said to me, she knows very well that I've had a gun in my mouth. And she says to me, you're doing the keynote. And I said, what do you want me to cover? And she goes, just give me some bullet points. And I let that hang in the air. And then she goes, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I said, relax, Michelle. I just couldn't let that go by without. So I think humor makes the information more digestible, more acceptable. And to your point, people have a vision of what mental illness looks like. And oftentimes it's a guy on the corner with a sign that says will work for food. That's like 4th stage mental illness. That society has failed that person all the way down the line. You see a comedian who's relatively high functioning on stage, someone else with mental illness up on stage and obviously high functioning, it changes perceptions, which can change prejudices and bring on change.
Yeah, I think humor is essential. It's hard to do. I'm not naturally funny, but I know the power of humor. And so I'll work with Frank. I have a couple of other folks that I was like, can you just sprinkle a couple of funny lines into this talk? Because it's absolutely, we can see it again on brain science, right? When people laugh, we release endorphins and we can relax. It is absolutely essential in the conversations around mental health and suicide, where people are on edge, just sitting like, oh God, what are we going to do here? And just getting them to laugh and relax into the information helps them access it better, and they can receive it better when they found a way to kind of exhale around the situation. I just wanted to touch on an earlier point, Josh, that you mentioned about how do we coach people to tell stories safely and effectively. And I'll just put in a quick plug for United Survivors. We actually have a storytelling course. We just had we have a part 1 that's been up, and it's really about think it through before you get up in front of CNN or in front of all your legislators or put yourself up on YouTube. Think it through before you get out there. And because there's a lot of pieces of this that people don't necessarily think about that have maybe potential unintended consequences to them or to other people in their life. So we just walk people through a whole bunch of steps around that. And then hopefully later this year or early next year, we'll have another course out that will kind of do all the things that we've been talking about, really help them shape a powerful, safe, and effective narrative that they can use to get to their why, whatever their why is. And then I also don't know that we've actually mentioned the name of the book, so I'm just going to name it again. It's called Guts, Grit, and the Grind. Guts, Grit, and the Grind. And we chose that because it flips both ways. So in one way, Guts, Grit, and the Grind talks a lot about kind of traditional norms of masculinity and white knuckling it and all the things that put a lot of men at risk for succumbing to overwhelming circumstances in their life. But on the other side, we can play that same Guts, Grit, and the Grind to the heroic journey that men take sometimes in kind of overcoming or living through or helping each other out and so forth. So we wanted just to call attention to the title and why we chose it. And our community exists on our website, gutsgritandthegrind.com. If you want to come on over there, we have lots of different media. Frank has done such a great job with all of his narration. We have these little beautiful clips from the book that people can get a sense of what it's all about and meet our storytellers. It's quite the community.
To meet me.
That's
Before
right.
I talk a little bit about storytelling, can I tell what may be my favorite clean joke?
Oh, yes, get it.
All right. I have a feeling Frank's already going to know this one. Okay. What's green, brown, fuzzy, has 6 legs, and can kill you if it falls out of a tree? A pool table. No, storytelling, it's funny. I don't think of myself as a storyteller, but really, now when people are talking to there, virtually everything I do in my life, whether it's work-wise, doing marketing for a company, or just talking to people or being a prayer leader, it all comes back to storytelling. Even like even if I'm on stage singing a song that a million other people might be singing that same day in various other places, you can have two people singing the same song, but just how they present it with their eyes or with their facial expressions, that one can be telling a much different story than the other. And I think that really storytelling is about taking what's inside us and sharing it with the world. And as I think both Frank and Sally mentioned, it takes practice. And obviously, I think that you should definitely encourage you looking to Sally's course. But, you know, you can also do things just looking in front of a mirror, saying, and it's not about that there's a right way or a wrong way to do it. But I think that if there is a right way, it is what is the most authentic way. And you can look at yourself in the mirror and saying, is that the authentic expression I'm looking to give off? And if not, and there's no right or wrong way in there, but it's just, you know, basically about, is this really me? Am I sharing this to the world because it's really me? Or am I sharing this to the world because it's trying to basically put an additional mask on myself? And one thing I've learned is that the more authentic you are, the more receptive the world is going to be, and happier you're going to be in yourself. And I guess that's all I got for right now.
And I think the more vulnerable you are on stage, especially for men who are rarely vulnerable, is that I was listening to Brene Brown's book on vulnerability, because people kept saying you got to listen to it. Okay, fine. So I'm about halfway through, and I realized that's one of my superpowers, is that vulnerability. I get choked up when I tell my story on stage, and I believe with an audience, you should take them from pole to pole. You know, bring them to tears, and then the opposite pole, and make them laugh. Because oftentimes they won't remember exactly what you said, but they will remember how they felt about what you said.
Fantastic.
100%.
We have covered a lot of ground, and I have two conflicting things going on here right now. One, I want to keep talking to you guys. I'm really enjoying this conversation. On the flip, I'm like, you have to put on your moderator hat and be like, we're at about the 45, 50-minute mark, so I want to be respectful of your time and of our listener watcher time as well. So I want to sort of wind down and ask a final question, and this goes for you as well. So just to our guests, what's maybe one final thing you'd want to impart upon our listeners as far as workplace mental health and or storytelling, or just something that you want to leave us with? Let's start with Sally, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there's a quote that I love. It's be vocal, be visible, be visionary. There's no shame in stepping forward, but there's great risk in holding back and just hoping for the best. So whatever that means for you, take a step in the arena, as Brene likes to talk about. Take a step to do the thing that feels very daunting around this conversation of mental health and suicide prevention. And maybe that first step is reading a story or watching a video or something. It's just something that takes you a step further in understanding your own personal journey with mental health, and also how you can impact the changes that you want to see.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sally. I think we're all fanboying and girling over Brene Brown. I'm a big fan as well.
She's pretty awesome.
She's pretty fantastic. And thank you for those words, Sally. That was poignant and much needed for sure. The baby steps we need. Frank, please and thank you. What do you got for us?
Yes, and if somebody is neuronormal, neurotypical listening to this, I would say that oftentimes people who are neurotypical don't really understand what it's like to live with a mental illness. And the simile that I use, and I just tossed it into a TED Talk, I had no idea the impact, is the story of Sisyphus. He fired a man, and his punishment was to roll a rock up a hill every day. And the idea being, if he got it over the top of the hill, he could retire, but he never quite got it over the top of the hill, and every day it rolled back to the bottom. Having a mental illness is like that. You wake up every morning, there's always a rock and there's always a hill. Some days the rock is small and the hill's not so steep. Some days the rock is boulder size and the hill is Kilimanjaro. And my job as a speaker on suicide prevention mental health is to make sure that anybody hears the sound of my voice, when they wake up in the morning, they can still move the rock.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you, Frank. Providing that hope and some healing words as well. Efrem, leave us.
Yeah, so we've talked a little about storytelling. We've talked a little about men, what the challenges they go through, as well as the challenges about what everybody goes through, no matter how they identify. And to tying all that, I'm going to actually point to, we've talked about the work of nonfiction that Sarah and Frank put together, but I'm going to reference a work of fiction that ties on a little bit of that has gotten a lot popular in recent years. Dear Evan Hansen, I really, the closing message from that, you're you and that's enough. And there's so many stories you could tell. So many stories you could tell that basically stretch the truth about yourself. But once you tell the story about yourself that's really authentically you, that's enough. And I think that's something that, like Evan Hansen, we may need to, in the end, remind ourselves of that every day. But really, that's the important thing. And when you do that, you're probably going to have better exchanges with the outside world. But one thing's for sure, or one thing I'd like to say is very, very likely, you will probably have an even better, the best relationship possible with yourself, which in the end is really what it's all about.
Thank you, F. That was quite beautiful as well. I didn't want to use the word poignant again. I've already said that. Where's your thesaurus, Josh?
I thought the word was illustrious.
No, I was gonna call you illustrious in just a second. That was my next move. It was like this guy who I sometimes call F and sometimes I call illustrious for no particular reason. But thank you to our guests. I think maybe one thing I'll just leave. It'll be a brief thing, but just to speak up and speak out and speak often and tell your story. There's a variety of ways that we can do it. It almost seems counterintuitive, but when we tell it for the benefit of others, it will in turn, on some level, benefit ourselves. There's science behind that. I'm not going to go into all that. We don't have another 4 hours, but but thank you so very much to our guests, to Mr. Illustrious himself, Efrem Epstein. I'm Josh Rivedal. This has been Cubicle Lift, episode number 3. We're going to continue to put out more episodes and pump it out into the world and hopefully change the conversation around workplace mental health and just the conversation in general. And we're working on websites. We've got LinkedIn going on, and we'll figure out how to maybe put some web links and make sure you can get in touch with all of us in a variety of ways. And we'll be timestamping this episode too, to make sure that you know where to find certain elements of this episode and to tune into that. So thank you once again. Good day.
Right, and I just want, I'm sorry, one last thing. The person who posts this on social media, who may or may not be me, is going to hopefully try to work in the link to the book in the social media. But if for some reason it doesn't work out and you're watching this, you're saying, where do I get the book? Put a note in the comments and we will direct you on how to order the books.
Thank you, Efrem. Thank you. I was going to try to pretend that my screen froze. But anyway, so thanks again. Good day. This has been Cubicle Lift. I'm Josh Rivedal with Efrem Epstein. Thanks again. Be well.